Welcome to the teenage home of Prime Minister Golda Meir on the historic Auraria campus. I'm Lena Fishman, the Executive Director of the Golda Meir House Museum, and it's an honor to have you here today. Golda Meir was the first woman democratically elected to lead a country. She was the fourth Prime Minister of the State of Israel, and she was a leader on the world stage who truly changed geopolitics in the 20th century. This is Golda meeting with President Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger. She knew how to run circles around them. She knew how to get what she wanted from them. She really is responsible for forging the relationship between the United States of America and the State of Israel. She nurtured that relationship, she strengthened it, and we see the results of that relationship today. This is a dress that she wore to a party that President Nixon threw for her in the White House. It was the biggest party ever thrown for a visiting dignitary up until that point. This is Golda, with the leader of Egypt, Sadat. She worked her entire life to pursue peace in the Middle East. And she is responsible for all of the work that led up to the peace that Israel has with the country of Egypt. This is this beautiful moment between Golda and Sadat. This is towards the end of both of their lives. And she is a grandmother and he is a grandfather. And she's telling him, from one grandmother to a grandfather, let's think about the future for our grandchildren and try to create a world that is safe for all of us to live in. This is a photo, one of my favorite photos in the museum, a beautiful moment in Africa. Golda, before she was prime minister, she was also the foreign minister in Israel, which is sort of like the Secretary of State. And she came up with the concept that Israel should be the type of country that exports aid and support and help wherever it's needed in the world. And she really started that concept in Africa. She felt a very close kinship with the countries of Africa because Israel had been colonized by the British, and of course the countries in Africa had also been colonized by European countries. And they all had to start countries from nothing after colonization. And she forged many beautiful partnerships where she really felt these countries in Africa and Israel could teach each other, and they formed programs in partnership about irrigation and technology and journalism and so many great partnerships that really strengthened both countries. Golda was also good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, and they both worked for so many of the same important programs for children and for families and for safety. And Golda, although she did not consider herself a feminist, like Eleanor Roosevelt, she was the embodiment of feminism. So Golda truly was a change maker, a leader on the world stage. But how did that happen? How did she break down the barriers to become this woman who is truly meeting with the most powerful people in the 20th century? How did she break down those barriers? How did she find the agency to do what she wanted to do and not just what society was expecting of her as a woman, as a Jew, and as an immigrant, as a refugee? Golda was actually born in the Ukraine, in Kyiv, Ukraine. She was born in 1898 during a time that sadly looks like Ukraine looks today. At that time, Ukraine was controlled by the Russian Tsar. There was a lot of violence, a lot of poverty, a lot of anti-Semitism. There were pogroms, government-sponsored mobs that would go through Jewish towns and destroy Jewish homes and Jewish businesses and do terrible things to Jewish people. And that's what Golda was born into. So how did this refugee, this woman, become the great Golda Meir? So how did Golda become Golda? How did she find the agency to break down barriers and become a world leader? She certainly had something special that she was born with, but I think part of the answer lies here in Denver. You know, this is Golda's family. This is about what they all looked like when they came to this country in 1906. This was Golda. She's around 6 or 7 years old, and her parents, and her youngest sister Clara, and her oldest sister Shayna, who is about 10 years older than Golda. And back in the Ukraine, Shayna was actually part of this underground group of teenagers secretly fighting the Russian Tsar, fighting for their independence. You know, it's the same group of fighters that we see today. And, you know, this was this very powerful moment in Shayna's life, doing this important work for freedom. At the same time, in this underground teenage revolutionary group, she meets the love of her life, Shammai. And one day, Shammai is arrested by the Russians, and he's put in a Russian prison. And at this point, Shayna and Golda's parents decide they must get out of the Ukraine, get out of Russia. It is just too dangerous. So they secretly leave. They take a dangerous journey across Europe, a boat into Canada, and a train down to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Milwaukee is really where Golda grows up. And when they get there, Shayna is, of course, quite heartbroken to leave this boyfriend behind in prison. She's worried, she's upset with her parents, and she leaves Milwaukee, and she decides to start her own life in Chicago, where she's working in factories to try to make enough money to take care of herself. Well, when Shayna leaves, Golda and her mother no longer have a buffer zone, and they're fighting a lot about everything. And some of the biggest fights happen when Golda completes 8th grade, and she announces that she'd like to go on to high school. And she also announces she'd like to become a teacher, which is one of the few professions open to women at that time. But at that time, in this country, in 1913 or so, women who are teachers are not allowed to also be married. So when Golda announces, "I'd like to become a teacher," her parents hear, "You won't be married." This is devastating news to them. Society and her parents always just expected that Golda, like other girls her age, would get married, have children, have a household to take care of, be a mother. And Golda may want those things, but she wants other things as well. And this fight is this severe fight, and Golda comes up with a plan. She concocts a plan with her best friend, Regina. And one day, Regina comes to Golda's house and knocks on the door and pretends to pick Golda up for school like they do every day, but they don't go to school. Instead, they go to the train station, and Regina helps Golda get onto a train, and Golda, all by herself, at the age of 14, runs away from home and comes to Denver, of all places. She lands in Union Station. Why Denver? Well, if we remember her older sister Shayna, who was in Chicago working in a factory with terrible working conditions, Shayna actually contracts tuberculosis. And Shayna, like thousands and thousands of other sick patients who have tuberculosis at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, come to Colorado to find a magical cure for their tuberculosis from our very dry air. And Shayna was a patient at National Jewish Hospital, where they put the patients in the balconies and in the window to take advantage of the Colorado air. And Shayna does recover, and National Jewish today is one of the leading respiratory hospitals in the world. So Shayna is here in Denver because of her tuberculosis, and Golda runs away from home to be here with her sister. With the help of her best friend, she comes to Denver to really start her life and pursue her education. And what we often say in this museum is that behind every great woman is a best friend and a sister. So Golda's here to continue her education. This is critical for her. And she goes to North High School, not far from this museum, a wonderful school, public school in Denver, where she does very well. She gets all A's. This is her report card, except for a C in art class. Not her part of the brain, who knows? But she was a very good student, and education was very important to her. After school, she works for her brother-in-law. Who's her brother-in-law, you say? Well, if you remember, Shammai, Shayna's boyfriend back in the Ukraine, who was stuck in a Russian prison, somehow gets out of prison, comes across the world, and magically finds Shayna. They reconnect, and they start a family. And this photograph is so special to this museum. This is Shayna, Golda's older sister, and her first daughter, Judith. And they're standing right in front of this house on the porch where you walked up on to come in and visit us today. After school, Golda works for her brother-in-law. Here he is, Shammai, this strong immigrant, hardworking immigrant. He owns a pressing business, and Golda, 14 years old, in 1913, works for him after school to kind of earn her keep so she can live in this house with her sister and her brother-in-law and her niece, this 3 little tiny bedroom house of this, one half of a duplex. This feels like a mansion to them. They're coming from the Ukraine, from Russia, where several families shared one little room. And so while this house may feel small to us as we walk through the 3 rooms, it actually was just the American dream coming true, owning all of this space in the wide spaces of the West in the United States of America. After school and after work, Golda returns to this house with her family, and that's when the magic begins for her. Welcome to the kitchen. This adorable room is actually the site of Golda's inspiration. But let's take a look at some of the fun aspects of a kitchen in the early 1900s on the west side of Denver. This is an ice box. Instead of a refrigerator, they had ice delivered, and food would be stored in there. Remember, this is a duplex, and the neighbors, the family lives next door, but it can be very cold in Denver. And this fun feature is called the egg exchange. If you needed a cup of sugar, you were baking a cake and you just didn't have it, you could just go to the neighbors through here and pick up your sugar or your egg. Just a fun, friendly, neighborly neighborhood aspect of living in Denver in the early 1900s. But this kitchen also represents the moment that Golda really started to become Golda. And if you remember, we talked about Golda's older sister, Shayna, and her brother-in-law, Shammai, as these revolutionists back in the Ukraine. And they bring all of that spirit with them to Denver. And they hook up with other immigrants of Denver that also have come here from dangerous places in Eastern Europe. And they gather here in this kitchen on a nightly basis to discuss all of the issues of the day. And, Golda writes in her autobiography towards the end of her life that it is here in Denver where her real education began. And what she's referring to are these talk-filled nights in her sister's kitchen when she's 14 years old and she's run away from home, and she's just at that moment where she's ready to figure out who she is and who she wants to become. And these discussions are happening with these immigrants who have come to Denver seeking freedom and grappling with all of the issues of the day. They're talking about women's rights. And we know that Colorado was the first state to give women the right to vote. And Golda is listening in on these conversations. And it's not a coincidence that she becomes, later on in her life, the first woman democratically elected to lead a country. She's here in Denver at the exact right moment to be inspired for that to happen. She begs her sister, can she please listen in on these conversations? And she offers to wash all the teacups at the end of the night. And I can imagine a stack of teacups in the sink, and it's 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. when these friends finally head home, and Golda's washing the teacups, and then maybe she falls asleep by 3, and by 6 she's up and has to then go on to her art class. Maybe that's why she got a C, who knows? But she certainly picks up so much information in this kitchen. They're discussing all of the themes that will guide the rest of Golda's life. Women's rights, workers' rights. They're talking about labor unions, and eventually Golda will go on to be, her political party will be the Labor Party of Israel, and she will have many jobs in Israel before she becomes prime minister, as housing minister, where it's her job to absorb refugees and find them homes and find them jobs, and all of that becomes important to her starting here when she's 14, 15 years old, here in this kitchen. And what else are they talking about? Well, they've all come from dangerous places, and they're talking about, is it possible for there to be a place somewhere in the world where Jews can be safe, where Jews have self-determination, and they are dreaming about a day where there might be a modern state of Israel. And it is here in this kitchen where Golda becomes a Zionist and works the rest of her life to build the state of Israel for the Jewish people and for the world. And I often look at this photograph. Golda's just a little bit older in this photograph than she would have been in Denver. She's 14 or 15 years old in Denver, maybe just a bit older here. And I don't know what she's really thinking, but in my mind, I think about her kind of reflecting back to her days in Denver. She's here only for 2 years. And thinking back to the conversations around this kitchen table, and really thinking about the impact that she wants to make on this world, and taking inspiration from Denver to think about who she wants to become and the eventual leader and change maker that she will be in this world. So Golda's only here for 2 years. Many of the men gathering in this kitchen are interested in Golda. She probably was very impressive, and actually for her entire life there's something magnetic about her. People are really drawn to her, and some of these men, or maybe many of these men, would like to take her out on dates. And her older sister Shayna does not like this idea. She's feeling very protective, or maybe overprotective, and she's not allowing Golda to go on the dates. And Golda becomes very upset. She wants to do what she wants to do. She's a teenager or whatever it is, and she gets now in a big fight with Shayna. And she's only in Denver for about 2 years, and then she leaves Denver and she says, fine, then I'll go somewhere else. And she now makes up with her parents and she moves back to Milwaukee, but now her life is on her terms. She graduates high school and she does go on to teaching school, and her political career begins. And in the early 1920s, she will move with her husband, who she also happens to meet in this kitchen, and she will move to the state of Israel and become one of its founders. We invite you to come down to the Auraria campus to hear more Golda stories and visit us here in this special historical house.